and we are continuing our reading of Dragon Maid, a novel by Rona Randall. I walked away from the window, untying my bonnet with fingers that were suddenly unsteady. Then I shed my cloak and turned to smooth my hair before the dressing-table mirror. Julian was still standing beside the window, staring fixedly outside, and I knew he wasn't even aware that I was near. The knock on the door was almost like a reprieve, breaking a spell that had threatened to separate us. A maid entered, who I guessed was Lucy. She carried more candles, and behind her came two undermaids bearing a steaming tub of water. Lucy bobbed a curtsy. "I thought Madame would wish to take a bath after her journey." As she spoke, she crossed the room and drew back a heavy tapestry curtain, revealing an alcove, rather like a ruelle in a French chateau, containing a hip bath, a screen, a table bearing a pitcher and bowl, and a wooden rack with towels. While the maids emptied the hot water into the bath, Lucy set down the candles, then began to unpack my carpet-bag. "Leave that," Julian commanded. "You can unpack for your mistress when our trunks arrive." "They are on the way up, sir. Smithers and Bateman are bringing them now." "Then return later." "Yes, sir." She bobbed another curtsy and made for the door. I picked up a robe which she had dropped on the bed and smiled at her reassuringly. The girl was flustered by Julian's peremptory dismissal, and it was even more peremptory to the manservants who appeared at that moment. "Put those trunks down and be gone." They obeyed hurriedly, and I went into the alcove, drawing the heavy curtain behind me. I heard the grating of a key as it locked our door, and knew that Julian, in the unpredictable way with which I was already becoming familiar, had descended into one of his withdrawn moods. As I undressed, I was already making excuses for him. He was tired. Presenting me to his stepmother, not to mention the endless line of servants, must have been a strain, for no doubt he had been anxious despite all his pretense. I thought of plenty of reasons for his change of mood, but knew that there was really only one. The view of the lake had reminded him too painfully of his brother's death. That was why he had been shocked into silence on hearing that we had been allotted the yellow room. He didn't want it. I was about to step into the hip bath when the heavy curtain rings jerked along the rail. Being naked and startled, I slipped behind the screen, whereupon Julian thrust it aside. "What's this?" he scoffed. "False modesty all of a sudden?" I was startled. I had forgotten the maids had gone. I thought perhaps— The words sounded lame, my voice tired. I was tired. I wanted nothing so much as to sit in that hip bath with the warm water lapping up to my breasts, relaxed and quiet. I didn't want my husband to bring his black mood into this semi-private place. I didn't want my peace invaded. I wanted to be alone, just for a little while, before I dressed and went downstairs for the late supper which Miriam had told us would be served in an hour's time. By then Julian's moroseness would have vanished, probably as quickly as it had arisen, and later we would be happy together in the darkness of the night, and from my mind would be blotted out even the memory of his indifference to human suffering and degradation, which had shocked me so much that even now it lingered in the back of my mind. Although I had told myself repeatedly that men had a different attitude towards these things, that they were more practical and less emotional than women, and I had to be. I was ready to seek and find excuses for anything that might seem like a fault in this man whom I had loved so obsessively. But Julian had no intention of leaving me alone just now. He looked me up and down, ran his hands over my body, let them roam where they willed, gripped my breasts until they hurt, and when I cried out, he pushed me aside. "Don't ever protest like that again. I own you, remember that. I own every inch of you." The curtain closed behind him, jerked back savagely along the rail. I sank into the steaming water gratefully and closed my eyes. He was right, of course. My body was all I had brought him. I was no rich bride who could help her husband financially. He had gained nothing by marrying me. The gain was all on my side. When I emerged from the alcove, I saw my sapphire gown upon the bed, and our trunks agape. Julian had unlocked them and apparently selected this gown for me. It was the one Michel had made me, the one I had worn the first evening he had spent at the Bloomsbury house. He had told me several times that it was his favorite, and I was touched that he should think of it now. Anxious to appease him, I said, "You especially want me to wear this?" He nodded. It is becoming and ladylike. It will give a good impression. Dampened, I said nothing, but I sat down before my dressing table and began to brush my hair. In the candlelight it gleamed, dark and glossy as shining new chestnuts, and my complexion, fresh from the warm bath, was glowing and flawless. Usually my husband would come and stand behind me, taking the brush from my hand and running it through my hair. It was something he loved to do, but tonight he seemed to have forgotten it. He was back at the window, staring down upon the lake. I said gently, "Come away from there, Julian. It is time to dress. Your stepmother said supper would be served in an hour." "The Lady Miriam," he corrected sharply. "The daughters of earls or dukes who marry men of lesser rank take the same order of precedence as their husbands, but are referred to as they were before marriage. So Miriam isn't just plain Lady Kershaw, but the Lady Miriam Kershaw, referred to in the third person as the Lady Miriam, but addressed personally simply as Lady Miriam." My cheeks blazed. So did my anger. I retorted, "I need no instruction. I was educated at Bedlington and made many friends there, apart from which my mother was not an ignorant woman, and nor am I. In referring to the Lady Miriam as your stepmother, I was not displaying ignorance. I notice you call her by her Christian name only. Will the time come when I shall be so privileged, or am I to address her formally and speak of her formally forever, like an outsider?" He was sorry immediately. He came across and put his hands on my shoulders, full of contrition. "I'm a brute. Forgive me." I was in no forgiving mood. I jerked away and went on brushing my hair. I saw his reflection in the mirror and was glad to see that it was shamefaced. "Aren't you going to change?" I asked coolly. "I imagine the Lady Miriam will dislike being kept waiting." "First say I am forgiven." When he spoke like that, when he smiled like that, he was irresistible. I yielded inevitably. "I ought to be angry." "You were angry, my love, and with justice. I spoke without thought." And he had hurt me without thought in the privacy of my toilet alcove. I thrust the memory of that aside and asked him to summon Lucy for me. He crossed to the elaborately embroidered bell rope beside the fireplace, then to the door, which he unlocked. Simultaneously a tap came upon a side door leading from our room, which I had failed to notice. Apparently it led into Julian's dressing room, for a valet appeared and asked if his master was ready to dress. Shortly after the dressing room door had closed upon them, Lucy came hurrying, and we embarked upon the elaborate ritual of lacing. I held on to a carved bedpost while she threaded and pulled, remarking with admiration that with such a tiny waist it was scarcely necessary. "My mother's waist is almost as small even now," I told her, and was aware of a sudden longing for Luella. I even felt nostalgic for the Bloomsbury house, although I had no desire to ever live there again. One changed in more ways than physically after marriage. One quickly severed one's ties with the past, and I knew that when I revisited my mother's house it would seem more alien now than when I had periodically returned to it from Bedlington. But on the other hand, could I ever fit into such a background as this? Okay, I've got bugs in here. Could I ever feel at home in this bleak, unfriendly mansion, with its thick stone walls and its retinue of servants? A touch of my earlier apprehension returned. If the remaining members of Julian's family were as unwelcoming as his stepmother, I could expect a difficult time. Lucy was holding out my first petticoat, and I stepped into it mechanically, then into the next and the next, until the billowing foundation for my gown was complete. After Lucy had slipped it over my head and fastened the endless hooks and eyes, she stood back admiringly. In the candlelight the blue looked an even deeper sapphire, and somehow the color seemed to be reflected in my eyes. "You look beautiful, madam, beautiful." I looked at Lucy's round and homely face, liking what I saw. The honesty and simplicity there made me feel oddly comforted. "Your jewels, madam?" "I wear none with this gown." "Can you put the finishing touches to my hair?" But in that respect she was no Michelle, and I knew that I would have to be my own hairdresser at Dragonmead. I struggled to remember the way in which Michelle had coiled the chignon at the nape of my neck, and by the time Julian emerged from his dressing room I had somehow achieved it. From the approving glance he gave me, I knew it was to his liking. He looked very handsome in his formal dinner clothes, and as we turned to leave the room, I saw our joint reflection in a long cheval mirror. He was standing slightly beside me, looking down at my bare shoulders, and suddenly he kissed the side of my throat and the curve between shoulder and neck. As he looked up, his eyes met mine in the mirrored reflection, and desire was there. He whispered, "Forgive me for hurting you. I don't know what came over to me. I swear to God I will never abuse your lovely body again." I turned and kissed him, and he clung to me, whispering urgently that he wished we could dine alone up here, and what a bore it was having to eat with family. Memories of our cloistered hours in the Grosvenor Square apartment came flooding back. There had been no restraints between us there, no tensions, no stresses. We had been uninhibited and free in a way that I feared we would never know again, and Julian had been himself in a way that I also feared I would never know again. Since he had crossed the threshold of Dragonmead, his personality seemed to have subtly changed, or perhaps it had started earlier than that, during the journey, when a kind of devilish excitement seemed to stir in him, culminating in the Black Mood, shot through with cruelty and patronage. Was there something about this sinister place that brought out a different side of his character? And in clinging to me at this moment, was he aware of it and afraid of it? Seconds later I was dismissing the idea, for he was smiling at me with his normal charm, and as he led me along the corridor he said happily, "I am proud of you tonight, Eustacia. You look beautiful. Miriam will feel her nose put more out of joint than when you arrived." "Surely she didn't." "But of course she did. If you were not so modest, you would have been aware of it as acutely as I. Apart from your youth and good looks, you are a threat to her future position. When my father dies, you will replace her as mistress here, and poor Miriam will have to retire to the dower house. After being Queen of Dragonmead and waving a magic wand over the place ever since she married my father, that will be a bitter pill to swallow." The thing which struck me was that he said this with amusement, and yet he had professed to think highly of his stepmother. I answered, "I don't want her to feel that way. We must reassure her somehow." We had reached the top of the stairs. Below us spread the vast hall, a place of flickering candlelight and wavering shadows. I wondered if I would ever get used to it. It seemed like the empty heart of an empty home. But if the great hall was a barren and echoing place, the drawing-room was not. Double doors opened upon a room tastefully furnished, the rich sheen of rosewood, walnut, and mahogany reflected against the mellow paneled walls. Light was everywhere, gleaming from the oil lamps and immense candelabra, from which massed candles shone down upon the richness of the Aubusson carpets and deep red velvet window draperies. A blazing long fire roared in the Gothic hearth, and beside it sat the Lady Miriam, looking extremely elegant in the eau de Nile satin, with a wide fichu of Brussels lace. Diamonds sparkled at her throat and upon her wrists and fingers. Opposite her sat another woman, older, white-haired, and far less richly dressed. She turned as we entered and focused upon me a frank but not unfriendly stare. Then she rose and came out to meet me, hand outstretched. "So you are Eustacia. You must forgive my absence when you arrived, but it happened to coincide with my brother's needs. He retires early, which means he must dine early, and that means I must be with him for most of the evening hours. No, Julian, no formal introductions. I am sure you have told your wife all about the family, so she must know that I am your Aunt Dorcas." She turned to me and finished, "Dorcas Bly, my dear, and welcome to Dragonmead." I felt that here was someone who really meant it. I liked her at once. I liked her open smile and unaffected manners. I liked her brisk handshake and frank way of speaking. So this was a woman who had displeased her parents by marrying a lowly village doctor. Matthew Bly had been fortunate, I thought. I was aware of her keen gray eyes studying me, but her scrutiny was uncritical. I felt that she was weighing me up against some mental picture or some preconceived idea of what I would be like, and I wondered how I matched up to it. When I smiled, she gave an apologetic laugh. "Forgive me, child, but when a woman gets to my age, she finds it hard to suppress curiosity. Naturally, we have been wondering what you were like." Julian's eulogy in his hastily written letter was brief but eloquent, but not eloquent enough. Your wife is lovely, nephew, and now I promise to stare at her no more. I joined Miriam upon a sofa. She gave me a cool little smile and drew her skirts aside, although there was little more than enough room for both of us. Then she picked up a glass of wine and continued to sip it. She had been doing so when I entered, and I had a feeling that this was by no means her first glass. There was a haziness about her eyes as she stared morosely into the fire. I wondered if I would ever be able to talk to my mother-in-law, and what, in the event, we would find to talk about. We came from worlds that were poles apart. If she knew the truth about mine, she would undoubtedly be shocked, and if she was shocked, I in turn would be resentful, because it would imply criticism of my mother, and the way in which she had brought me up, and criticism of Luella was something I would never tolerate. She had been the victim of a circumstance and a too responsive heart. Sorry, don't need the noise from the other room. Where was it? There we go. I became aware that Julian had placed a glass beside me, and that Aunt Dorcas had continued to chatter in her amiable fashion. But now she said something which brought Lady Miriam's head up with a jerk, proving that although she appeared to be lost in her own thoughts, her ears were alert. What Dorcas Blythe said was that Victoria would not be too pleased. Since I did not know who Victoria was, or what would displease her, the words meant nothing to me. But they evidently meant a great deal to Miriam, because apart from jerking to attention, she commented sharply, "Victoria won't mind in the least. Why should she? A girl as intelligent and accomplished as she won't go into decline just because the man she was going to marry comes home with a wife." My dog doesn't like having the door shut. Come on. There we go. Arrgh. Oh well. Startled, I felt my hand jerk and saw wine splash upon my gown. Julian dabbed at the spot with his handkerchief, completely composed, saying smoothly, "May I point out that Victoria and I were never, ever betrothed." "But that didn't prevent her or her father and everyone else from expecting that you would be," Aunt Dorcas replied. "But I agree with Miriam. Victoria isn't the type of young woman to go into decline. And with her looks and accomplishments, not to mention determination, she will soon be looking elsewhere, and if she has not done so already. In my opinion, you have made the better choice, nephew. I like your Eustacia." "My dear Dorcas, you may pride yourself on your frankness, but it isn't always tactful." Miriam's voice had repressed irritation. "At times it can be thoroughly disconcerting, and as I am sure Julian's wife finds it now." I assured her that I found it not in the least disconcerting. How can one feel anything but pleasure upon hearing that one is liked? As for Victoria, whoever she may be, I am sorry if she has been displeased or disappointed, but not in the least sorry that it was I who married Julian. Miriam held out her glass to be refilled, saying as she did so, "Whoever she may be, my dear Eustacia, Victoria Bellamy is the daughter of a well-born and influential family. The man who gets her will be lucky." And if that isn't more disconcerting than any remark of mine, I would like to hear one. I felt that Aunt Dorcas wanted to say more, but wisely refrained. I was grateful to her, for my mother-in-law's words had carried a definite insinuation. Now she moved restlessly about the room, her gown rustling and swirling about her feet, and the wine in her glass rapidly diminishing. "Oh, I wish Christopher would hurry," she fretted between sips. "Once he starts painting, he becomes oblivious of time." "So a painting mood is on him, is it?" My husband's voice was fairly derisive, faintly indulgent, the voice of a layman who couldn't appreciate another person's talents. It perturbed me a little, but I had plenty of time to initiate him into the appreciation of art. I could start with the family portraits, so that he would cease to look upon them as merely a row of uninteresting ancestors. And when I had settled down at Dragonmead, I intended to start painting again. It was encouraging to hear that one member of the family shared my pleasure in it. "If he doesn't come soon, Garfield will announce supper. It really is naughty of him to be so late. and I do so dislike delayed meals. It's not working. I apologize. There we go. But despite her fretfulness, Miriam's voice was indulgent, and I remember Julian's telling me that she doted on her son. Nevertheless, she made me feel guilty about our belated arrival at Dragonmead, and even more guilty when I remembered the cause of it. If I had not yielded to that snatched hour of love-making, we could have caught an earlier train. We had been selfish, thoughtless, heedless of anyone but ourselves. But from now on, perhaps we would have a few opportunities to be alone except in the privacy of our room at night. So I felt no regret about the sudden impulse that had made Julian pull me down upon the bed before finally terminating our honeymoon. We had been close then, far closer than we had been since stepping across the threshold of this ancient house. Even though his good humor had now been restored and he smiled at me fondly across the room, I was still aware of a threatening gulf between us, as if these people in this place were likely to force us apart. The doors opened abruptly and a youth stood there, one hand on each heavy wrought knob. I knew at once that this was Christopher. Like his mother when she had appeared at the head of the front steps, he held the pose before coming into the room, but not for so long. While he stood there, he looked like a portrait in a frame. A portrait of an elegant youth, slightly built, pale, with a lock of corn-colored hair falling over his brow, and more growing long and low at the back of his neck. Not an outdoor youth, to judge by his pallor. There was also a pampered air about him. His features were almost delicately chiseled, and would have been becoming on a girl. Forgive my tardiness, Mamma. He closed the doors behind him and moved gracefully across the room. He, too, eyed me appraisingly, but without his mother's coldness. There was friendliness there. So this is Eustacia. He lifted my hand and kissed it, his long hair swinging forward as he bowed. I sensed rather than saw Julian's irritation as the youth tossed it back. All right, I thought, so he is a bit of a poser. But why? Because it was one way of combating shyness or self-consciousness, even a feeling of inferiority? I guess he has been outshone all his life by his two very masculine half-brothers. I wondered what their father had been like. The speculation was in the past tense, because now that he was afflicted, I knew he must be the shadow of his former self. I wanted to meet him, but was apprehensive. Not because meeting an afflicted person was something I dreaded, but because I wondered how he would react to me. Would he be able to conceal his feelings, or would I be met with his plain, unvarnished truth? I felt there would be no glossing over, as with a person in full control of his faculties. The eyes of the sick could be eloquent, and although Julian's father had lost the power of speech, he might well betray himself even more clearly than his self-controlled wife had done. If he liked me, all would be well. If he did not, if anger at his son's whirlwind marriage had prejudiced him against me, I would be grieved, for Julian's sake as well as my own. The Lady Miriam's announcement that I could not be presented to her husband that night was something of a reprieve, for meeting these three, especially my mother-in-law, was strain enough for the time being. She was gracious to me in her way during the belated meal, which she automatically took her place at the head of the table. For tonight, she announced, Eustacia will sit on my right. I am sure Julian won't mind assuming her place on my left. This is just this once. Let me check. Okay, we are halfway done. Okay. A stickler for etiquette, apparently, unbending in my favor only, because this was a special occasion. Although the family were so few in number, I guessed that the precedence would always be preserved. The heir to Dragonmead normally sitting on the right of its mistress, his wife on her left. Then on Julian's right the next heir, with Aunt Dorcas, the poor relation, last of all. And beyond, nothing but an long expansive table, big enough for a banquet. Things would have been a great deal more cozy, and certainly a great deal more friendly, if we had seated ourselves round a small table near the fire. Warmer, too. At this distance one could feel little from the deeply recessed hearth at the far end, where a basket grate sent most of the heat up the chimney and little into the room. I decided that when I eventually became a mistress here, I would choose a smaller room than this for family occasions. Somewhere in this great house there must be one more suitable and a great deal more intimate than this, with its vaulted ceiling and shadowy corners. Alongside an immense sideboard, impassive servants waited to serve, presenting apparently deaf ears to the conversation. I caught Aunt Dorcas's eye, and had the uncanny feeling that she was reading my thoughts, for a smile flickered about her mouth, and for a moment I thought she gave an imperceptible nod, as if to say, "I quite agree, my dear. This isn't what family life should be at all." But perhaps I was mistaken, for when I gave her a second glance, her attention was upon the food. Throughout the meal I was scarcely aware of what I ate, for I had little appetite. Fatigue was slowly creeping upon me, and I wanted nothing so much as to retire. Lying close to Julian in the great four-poster, I would feel safe and secure again. I heard him inquiring after Dorcas's son. I knew it was mere politeness, for my impression that Julian disliked his cousin remained with me still. But naturally it pleased his aunt, who announced proudly that Dr. Fothergill had made Nicholas his partner now. He has rooms above the Rye surgery. This suits Fothergill well, for he is able to spend more time at his home in Winchelsea, tending his garden, and it pleases Nicholas, who loves nothing as much as his work. "Even more than women, I think," Miriam remarked, in a tone which implied that this indicated a lot. Julian laughed. "I find that hard to believe. My worthy cousin's Achilles' heel is his weakness for the opposite sex." He turned a mocking eye upon Christopher and finished, "Which is more than can be said for you, sir." "Christopher has plenty of time," Miriam interposed in swift defense. "He is only 21. In 21 years a man reveals his sexual appetite." Julian was impervious to his stepmother's frown and his half-brother's painful flush. I felt a sneaking pity for the Lady Miriam, brought up in a world in which any word pertaining to sex was not only taboo but vulgar and ill-bred, and an equal pity for her son, who was plainly hurt by his taunts. I cast around in my mind for some change of subject, but the moment was mercifully saved by Aunt Dorcas, who asked me if I enjoyed riding. I admitted that I had not ridden since leaving Bedlington Grange, but that I was looking forward to doing so again. "Bedlington!" There was an unflattering surprise in my mother-in-law's voice. "So you were finished at Bedlington? I had no idea." "I have always heard that the place turns out young women of charm and good manners," Dorcas commented. "Now I believe it." I was grateful for both her words and for her smile, grateful too for the arrival of the next course. After this there would be only one more to sit through. I stifled a yawn, and prayed that we would not be expected to linger over coffee, but that the lateness of the hour and the fatigue of our journey would excuse us. Aunt Dorcas was saying that Ladybird might be a good mount for me. She's a bay mare and trained to the side saddle. "But she needs expert handling," Miriam pointed out. "She has white socks on her forelegs, and white socks on a lady's horse often go with speed, sometimes too much. Victoria has ridden her often enough." "But Victoria is an excellent horsewoman." "As my wife may prove to be," Julian put in. "London bred?" His stepmother regarded me skeptically. "Some of the worst riders I have ever seen are those in Rotten Row. They don't ride, they parade. You have to be a countrywoman to be a good rider, brought up to hounds." I said lightly to Julian, "I doubt if I can match up to your Victoria." I was a competent pupil, but not brilliant. Why did I call her his Victoria? It was a slip of the tongue, but it worried me. However, he failed to notice it, and said reassuringly that by the time he had me out in the park a few times, I would manage Ladybird well enough. Throughout this conversation, Christopher had remained silent. In an attempt to draw him into things, I turned the topic to painting, saying I hoped he would let me see his work. But before he had a chance to reply, his mother announced that Christopher had allowed no one to see it except herself. "He is sensitive, this boy of mine." She reached across the table and patted his hand possessively, and when he jerked it away she gave an indulgent laugh. "And he doesn't like being fussed over, do you, my pet?" Julian told Christopher that there was now a member of the family to whom he should really show his work. "Eustacia is a real artist. She studied under Joseph Whitehead. I have to admit that I have never heard of the fellow until we met, but as you know, art isn't my cup of tea. Christopher looked at me almost with awe. Whitehead? The Joseph Whitehead? You must be very talented. I was fortunate. He had other students, but I was one of the few females lucky enough to be accepted. Which proves how good you must be, Dorcas put in. My son thinks highly of the Whitehead's work. Nicholas! What does he know about painting? A country doctor. There was contempt in my husband's voice. He has learned a certain appreciation from Solomon Slocum. But how little you really know my son. His interests are wide and varied, although medicine, of course, is his passion. Julian shrugged indifferently, and I said again to Christopher that I would very much like to see his paintings, to which he hesitantly replied that perhaps he should let me, sometime. She is a good judge, I do assure you, Julian put in. Not until this evening did I learn that our dreary collection of ancestral portraits might well be masterpieces. At this my stepmother bridled, or his stepmother bridled. They are masterpieces. Those painted of my family at least. But neglected, apparently. Neglected and begrimed. Did you realize that? Did any of us realize that? Were we even aware that they are badly in need of restoration? Do we even bother to glance at them in their tarnished frames? Yet they were the first thing to catch Eustatia's eye as we went upstairs. She was shocked by their condition, weren't you, my love? And eager to put matters right. And I do believe she could do it. She knows all the technical jargon. You should get her to talk about them, stepmother. You would be surprised by her knowledge. The Lady Miriam pushed back her chair, saying pettishly that she resented the suggestion that she, the mistress of this house, should have neglected such treasures, or allowed them to gather dirt, adding that she always made sure that the staff dusted them properly. I said pacifically that pictures could darken with age, no matter how diligent a domestic staff might be. In art galleries they have skilled attention, which no ordinary servants can carry out. The care of oil paintings requires special training, special knowledge. She looked appeased but suddenly bored, and as we followed her back to the drawing-room, I reflected that my handsome mother-in-law was over-inclined to touchiness, and would need careful handling. The men accompanied us. I felt this was because Julian had no desire to linger over port with Christopher. Whenever he spoke to the youth, there was a touch of intolerance in his voice. The intolerance of a masculine man for the effeminate. I found myself feeling even more sorry for the boy, and yet a certain impatience when he rejected Julian's invitation to join him in a brandy, because his mother forbade it. You are too young, my darling. Brandy is a man's drink. And yet he was a year older than I, and I had no doubt that at his age Julian and Gerald had put boyhood well behind them. Aunt Dorcas was the first to withdraw, saying she must see if her brother needed anything, but that she hoped he would still be asleep. At this Miriam sighed unhappily. My poor husband, that he should linger only to suffer. Life can be so cruel. Cruel to whom, I wonder? To Sir Vivian, or to herself? I thought that I detected a note of self-pity in her voice, and perhaps Dorcas Bly did too, because she merely said good night and turned away. Before departing, however, she put her hands on my shoulders and kissed my brow. As soon as my brother is well enough for you to see you, Eustacia, I will take you to him. Meanwhile, forgive the delay. It is better than that he should recover a little. From the shock of our marriage, Julian challenged. I have already told Miriam what I think about that. My father should be glad I have a wife, even if it isn't the wife he expected. A man likes to choose his own bride. Tell him that, Aunt Dorcas, as soon as he is fit enough to hear it. Better still, I'll tell him myself. Dorcas answered calmly. I'm quite sure he's aware of it, Julian. Your father was a man, too, once upon a time. It wasn't until morning that I realized how beautiful the yellow room was. Tension and tiredness had caused me to pay little attention to it until then. I was quickly in bed that first night, waiting for my husband in the huge four-poster bed, and feeling so overpowered by the canopy overhead that I was thankful when he emerged from his dressing room and came to join me. I had extinguished all candles except those beside the bed, and as Julian plunged the room into final darkness, then he reached for me. I went to him thankfully, sinking comfort in his arms. Only then did I realize to the full how difficult this first evening in his home had been. I felt as if I had been on trial and wondered how long the trial would last, with my mother-in-law as both judge and jury. Aunt Dorcas was a different proposition altogether. Perhaps because of her position at Dragonmead. She had a home here in return for nursing her brother, but at least I reflected it was a home in which she had been born and brought up. I wondered what it felt like to be readmitted into a wealthy household after rejecting it for a poor one, and how she had fared when she turned her back on Dragonmead and embarked on a humbler life as the wife of a village doctor. And when she returned here as an aging widow to take second place to her brother's second wife, had she felt as I feel now, alien and bewildered? It must have been strange indeed to come back to one's family home and find it ruled by a new mistress. But all these thoughts slid from my mind as Julian drew me to him. Afterwards I slept almost at once, but during the night I wakened with a feeling of being abandoned. With a sense of panic, I stretched out an arm only to find the bed empty beside me. I then instinctively knew that it had been empty for a long time. Then I became aware of something else. The room was filmed with moonlight. I sat up with a jerk and saw that the curtains had been drawn back. Outlined against the window was my husband's figure, standing very still, staring down upon the lake. He did not even hear me move, although the bed creaked loudly. He was like a man mesmerized, a man I did not know. Let's see how our time is. Oh, we got time for one more chapter. Unless you guys have any questions. Let me check Twitch and see how it looks. Anybody have any questions or anything? Speak up in chat. Hello, anyone here? Okay, number 5. I had been at Dragonmead a week and had still not met my father-in-law. Dorcas told me that the delay was due to his condition, and because I judged her to be an honest woman, I suppressed the feeling that I was being kept away from him. The fact that even his wife visited him for only short times each day, and some days I suspected not at all, should have reassured me. But somehow I knew this was from her own choice. Insidiously, a disturbing picture began to build up in my mind. The picture of a man so stricken that he was frightening. I wondered if his illness had been something worse than a stroke, leaving him mentally deranged, violent, perhaps, or whether Miriam was merely a woman easily upset by the sight of illness. It was obvious that the lady of the house was thoroughly spoiled. I wondered if she had been pampered as a girl, so sheltered from the harsh realities of life that she was unable to face up to them now. She had been surrounded by luxury always, and still was. The extent of that luxury was such as I had never dreamed of. In all my visits to wealthy school friends, I had never come across a woman so cosseted or so well endowed with this world's goods, and yet she took them all for granted. The jewels, the clothes, the fleet of carriages, the finely bred horses, the obsequious servants, the costly out-of-season foods, which she invariably toyed with and then pushed aside, the humoring and the indulging and the pandering to her vanity, to which even my husband contributed. I began to suspect that her petulance was due to boredom, self-pity, and lack of interest in others, with the exception of her son, on whom she lavished wholly possessive affection. But sometimes I did wonder if her discontent might be due to something deeper, something that she kept hidden from the eyes of the world or escaped from by overindulgence. Her fondness for wine was impossible to overlook. Was it a refuge for her? A source of oblivion? From the morning after our arrival, Julian wasted no time in taking up the reins of the state again, with the result that I now saw little of him except at meal times and when we went to bed at night, and even then he was sometimes too tired for conversation, and occasionally even for love-making. There had been no repetition of this nocturnal staring at the lake. He slept through the night and rose early, wasting no time in getting to work. The estate was vast, comprising not only Dragonmead itself and the immensity of the surrounding park, but further acres divided into large areas of grazing land for deer, cattle, and sheep, with miles of undulating meadow and woodland left untouched. Timber from regularly replenished forest lands was another source of revenue. Then there were the home farm, devoted to dairy produce, and the little farm, which reared poultry, and the meadow farm, with its flowing fruit orchards and hop fields, which rivaled those of nearby Kent. Each farm was run by a resident factor, but all came under Julian's supervision. With the assistance of an able steward named David Foster, a well-set-up young man whom I liked on sight, the son of a lesser Dorset landowner who would one day take over his parents' farms. I felt that such an able young man would be hard to replace. Then there were the cottages of the estate workers, farm laborers, and forestry hands. All demanded maintenance, and Julian was no indifferent landlord. His pride in everything pertaining to Dragonmead was self-evident, as was his gratitude to his stepmother for endowing it so lavishly. Her fortune had been responsible for the rebirth of a place that was his world, his life, his kingdom. His kingdom. The thought sprang unbidden to my mind when, out riding one day, I saw him standing high upon a hill. At this moment he looked a very different person from the man I had met in London. Here he was a man of the country, and his swift transition from the well-tailored man about town to the outdoor squire was something that surprised me, although even in country clothes he was immaculately turned out. His tweeds were always of the finest, his riding clothes fitted like a glove, hand-tailored like his town suits, and in the evening the quality of his formal wear would have graced a prince. He was, I knew, his valet's pride. He was also mine. I looked at him now, standing tall and erect, his splendid figure outlined against the sky, and I reined in Lady Bird so that she stood to attention obediently. Okay, what's up with that? Okay, it's still going. And as Julian had predicted, I had quickly become accustomed to handling her. Although she certainly had a tendency to be highly strung, I had realized at once that here was a lady of mettle, and that to control her it was necessary to make her aware that I had mettle too. That accomplished, I had achieved supremacy over my white-socked bay mare. We understood and respected each other, so now she stood quietly, awaiting my next command. I could feel her quivering to be off, but I was absorbed in this secret contemplation of my husband. Coming upon him like this, at a moment when he was entirely alone and unaware he was watched, I saw him without any social mask and was impressed. Even now, in breeches and leggings, he had that air of distinction which had impressed me at our very first meeting. At this moment I had a sideways view of him, with his profile etched against the sky. A gun was slung beneath his arm, and suddenly it occurred to me that I rarely saw him without that gun. He carried it as automatically as another man might carry a walking stick. It seemed to be the insignia of a country gentleman. Lady Bird was getting impatient. I quieted her, and I did so as a cock pheasant, startled by something unseen, broke cover with his strange coughing cry, and went winging in a span of magnificent color across the near horizon. He was a beautiful sight, plumage vivid, his head proud, his wings outspread, and long tail feathers streaming. I caught my breath, marveling at the sight of him. Then, without warning, there was a shattering explosion, and the bird's dead body plunged from the sky. Shock made my body slump in the saddle, and my hands slacken. It also sent Lady Bird off at a gallop, her hoofs thundering. I lost the reins, groped wildly for them, and grabbed and missed again. She was racing up the hill so that I was able to thrust my body forward over her neck as I maintained the secure side saddle position with my right leg hooked over the pommel and my foot behind the calf of my left leg. I firmly planted in the stirrup, though my startled mind ran the reassuring thought that it was difficult to throw a rider mounted side saddle. But on a horse as mettlesome as this one, already terrified anything could happen when we reached the downward plunge. I saw the hill's crest looming ahead, and was aware that as Lady Bird stampeded, my husband's voice echoed in a shout, which came again and again. But it was nothing more than a receding sound beneath the thunder of her hoofs. I reached down to catch the swinging reins, but missed once more. Then suddenly she was storming over the brow of the hill, and I thrust my body backward to brace against the pitch of her back. Far below I saw the winding road to Rye across the Romney Marsh. Long before we reached it, I would shoot over Lady Bird's neck unless I could rein her. But the bit was now slack in her mouth, leather and martingale adrift. The situation was hopeless. Fear lurched in my stomach as my body began to sway, and my legs ached from maintaining their vital hold. Before I was thrown, my brain registered two things, their impressions stamped in one flashing moment. First, that the final drop of the hillside was so steep it would send Ladybird hurtling pell-mell down to the road, at a speed so uncontrolled that she would go plunging across it like the dike-ridden marshland, unless she could be halted abruptly, and second, that the only living thing in sight was a man riding along that road, his black hair bare to the wind. Then I leaped, wrenching my foot from the stirrup so my right leg was released, and dragged over the pommel. I felt the pull of my riding skirt as it remained hooked there. Then it was free, and I was rolling downhill in a scatter of loose stones and a cloud of dust, until my fall was mercifully braked by an out-thrusting bush. I could hear Ladybird storming away into the distance as I lay winded. After a while I moved gingerly and found that I was close to the bridle path which had showered me with dust and stones. And at that moment Julian appeared over the brow of the hill. He came leaping toward me, slithering down the steep plunge. Despite my shock, the anxiety in his face registered sharply, but I also saw the gun still in his hand. And as he reached me, knock that off. As he reached me, I flung out my arm, striking it from his grasp, hating him for what he had done to that wild and beautiful creature in the sky. I babbled senselessly at him until he seized me by the shoulders and shook me hard. I had no desire to look at him or listen to him, and apparently he sensed this, for he said not a word until he had examined me. Then he commented briefly that no bones seemed to be broken, but that the sooner he got me home, then better. Then Dr. Fothergill could be sent for. I'll ride over to Winchelsea and myself and fetch him. Now try standing. Take a step or two. See if you can walk. I obeyed shakily, but I suggested that I remain right where I was while he went in search of Ladybird. At that, Julian retorted that she could find her own way home. She deserves to be abandoned for bolting like that. Anyone would think I had taken a shot at her. I felt too shaken to argue and allowed him to help me up the bridle path. At one point I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no sign of Ladybird or of the dark rider. How are we doing on time, folks? 10 minutes. Be thankful for your youth and your strength, young lady. All you have suffered is a bit of a shaking and some bruises. Old Dr. Fothergill smiled down at me kindly, but I had the feeling he considered this call unnecessary. To a countryman, any rider should expect to take a toss now and then. Nevertheless, he prescribed a sleeping draught and the rest of the day in bed, then took his leave, anxious to get back to his roses, it seemed, for as Aunt Dorcas led him from the room he murmured something about Nicholas being on duty, not himself. Dorcas said pacifically that Julian had wanted no other doctor but him, pandering to male vanity, I thought wryly. When she returned and I refused the sleeping draught, but she insisted I take it. Shock is a great deal worse than bruising. My son always says that the medical profession doesn't yet heed the effects of shock sufficiently, but one day it will. Dr. Fothergill, of course, belongs to the old school, as does my husband. But Matthew always encouraged Nicholas to look ahead in the field of medicine, to study every new point of view before discarding it. So I have a feeling that what dear Dr. Fothergill regards as a bit of a shaking should not be lightly dismissed. So swallow this sleeping draught, Eustacia. Rest is what you need. She stood over me a while. I obeyed, then drew the curtain and left me. How long I slept I have no idea. I was awakened by voices which at first seemed to be a long way off, then suddenly close at hand. And as I struggled from sleep I realized they were the voices of two men. One was Julian's, the other unknown. I recognized her at once from the white socks on her forelegs. Fortunately, I managed to gallop alongside and grab her reins, but I couldn't bring her back to Dragonmead until I made a call in Appledore, which was urgent. I heard my husband expressing thanks, and the other man asking how it came about Ladybird was running loose like that. I was alert immediately, conscious of relief because the mare had been found. I wanted to thank her rescuer, and somewhat shakily slid out of bed. My head felt muzzy, but I pulled on a robe and made my way across the room. 3 tall windows overlooked not only the lake and the lawn sweeping down to it, but a wide terrace. The voices came from there, directly beneath the central window, which stood open. Outside was a balcony with a broad stone balustrade and carved pilasters. When I reached the window, I paused for a moment, trying to conquer dizziness, and during that pause I heard my husband say that Ladybird was much too easily frightened. She was startled by the sound of a gun and bolted. But this isn't shooting season, unless of course someone was taking a pot shot at a rabbit. That must have been it. But it wasn't. It wasn't. It had been the slaughtering of a beautiful bird at a time when such shooting was forbidden, which meant that the pheasant had been killed for one reason only, the delight of marksmanship. I was shocked by the fact that Julian concealed his guilt. For a moment I held onto the frame of the tall window while he went on talking. "She's too highly strung for my wife. I must find her another mount. I expect you saw her thrown?" I saw nothing until Ladybird came stampeding towards me with an empty saddle. So it was the lone dark rider. I thanked heaven he had been alert enough to break Ladybird's wild flight before she reached the marshes. I opened the window wider, stepped out onto the balcony to thank you, and was just in time to hear Julian say, "Eustacia will learn how to stay in the saddle with practice." "Eustacia? Is she as pretty as her name? She must be to make you jilt Victoria. So whom do I congratulate, you or your wife?" "Her, I imagine, for I gather she possesses no more than looks, which is unusual in a Kershaw bride." In the circumstances she had done well for herself, and from the sound of things hooked you quickly. Did she stage manage it herself, or did someone help her? I had never felt such fury. I wanted to hurl my indignation in this man's face. Instead, I remained quite still, shocked further by my husband's indifferent laugh. "You can congratulate me, cousin. Stacy has a great deal more than looks, if you know what I mean." "Come now, Julian. A man can get the best betting woman in London without marrying her, so there must have been another reason." I clutched the stone balustrade, and as I did so, I saw the two men below. The dark man's face was high cheekboned and strongly cut. I hated him. I also saw my husband's blond head and handsome features as he turned away, laughing uneasily. "You talk a lot of rubbish, Nick. What other reason could I have for marrying Eustacia other than loving her?" "That's what I'm wondering. Even getting her pregnant wouldn't be enough. Most men know how to deal with such situations." I stumbled back to bed, the contempt in that voice echoing in my ears. So this was Nicholas Bly, the cousin whom my husband disliked. Now I shared his dislike, and knew that it would have given me great satisfaction if Julian had done something stronger than dismiss the man's words with a laugh. Mercifully, sleep claimed me again, and I failed to stir until Julian joined me hours later, when I awakened only briefly before yielding once more to the effects of the sleeping draught. But when I finally awoke, my head was clear, and morning light sliced the curtains. Julian put his arms around me, inquiring solicitously how I felt. I assured him with truth that I felt completely well again. Indeed, I was so clear-headed that every detail of yesterday's events was etched in my mind. I could see the vivid burst of feathers against the sky and the dead body of the cock-pheasant plunging to earth. "Why did you do it?" I demanded. He was lazily kissing my throat, his hands exploring my body. At any other time I would have been responsive, but not now. Sensing this, he drew away. Why did I do what?" "Shoot that pheasant, out of season too, when there was no reason or excuse." "Why not? Any game or wildfowl in these lands belong to the Kershaws, in season or out." He thrust the bedclothes aside, reached for a robe, and continued with some irritation. "Before you start expressing opinions on life in the country, concentrate on getting accustomed to it. If you go around protesting against the killing of wildlife, you will make yourself unpopular." "With the hunting and shooting set? Do you think I would care?" "Bear in mind that I would. I don't want a wife who is squeamish." "It isn't squeamish to hate bloodshed." "That's a matter of opinion." "Christopher shares mine." "Christopher!" He spat at the name contemptuously. "He should have been born a girl." "He is sensitive." "And impotent, I'll warrant. He wouldn't know what to do if he found a woman in his bed." With a sudden change of mood, my husband leaned over me, smiling mischievously. "He couldn't give you the delight that I do, my love. What a pity it is morning, and I have work to attend to." I flung back. "And I such a good betting woman. Tell me, is that a country expression? I've never heard it before." His face changed. And where have you heard it now? From your companion on the terrace yesterday. I had been asleep when your voices awakened me. I gathered the man was your cousin. And what else did you hear? That you must have had some reason for marrying me, other than love. That I had done well for myself, hooking you quickly. Julian put his hand beneath my chin, tilted up my face, and kissed me. Then the teasing note returned. Well, my darling, that's the truth, isn't it? You did win me quickly, and since I am the right man for you, you did do well for yourself. And so did I. Against my will, I laughed. All the same, I insisted, I'm not prepared to forgive your cousin's insinuations, and I would have admired you more if you had just thrashed him for them. My Julian gave a mock shudder. My love, I would never enter into a fight with Cousin Nick. He won a boxing blue at Cambridge and was a champion of his medical school. The man's all beef and brawn, and his opinion's not worth heeding. Forget him. But somehow I knew that Nicholas Bly wasn't the kind of man a woman could forget. And with that, we are done for this week. I thank you for listening in. Please share with others if you like. The videos are still on my Twitch, and I will be uploading them to YouTube as well. Again, this has been Storytime with Lady Anna. Thank you.